Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified podcast. I'm your guest host today, Corey Knockreiner, and joining me today is another guest.
I'm Trevor Collins, a security engineer and second guest host.
Yeah, and as you can probably tell, I'm covering the main hosting duties because Mark is out for one more week, but you can look forward to him returning next week. Today's episode is mostly designed to focus on giving some quick highlights to our Q2 WatchGuard Internet Security Report. That said, we wanted to combine some news since there's a lot of interesting things happening. So in the news section, we'll also have a special local Australian IT and security expert give us some updates on the Optus breach. We'll cover the latest on the UBER CSO trial, and we'll also cover a set of zero-day exchange vulnerabilities that still haven't been patched. So strap on your rocket pack and let's blast on in. Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and jump into the first section of today's podcast, which is where we're going to cover WatchGuard's Q2, or the second quarter 2020 Internet Security Report. Before we jump into that, you will probably hear a new voice on this segment, because as you know, Mark is out this week. Joining me today, and you might see him as well if you actually watch this on YouTube. By the way, if you haven't noticed, if you're an audio listener, be sure to check out WatchGuard's YouTube, where you can watch our podcast as well. But joining me is Trevor Collins, one of our security engineers. Hey, Trevor, nice to have you.
Hey, Corey, thank you for having me. I am a security engineer, and hopefully I can give a little bit more details on the malware section as I'm primarily writing that, and do a lot of the data connections and the reports for the quarterly malware report. So.
Yeah. Besides being a great analyst on the CISO, my team, and doing all, we do a lot of writing for Secplicity, our internet security report, but you're key in our our computer security incident response team. My group manages WatchGuard's security operations center, including all the tools we use to monitor stuff. And Trevor is like a key person in setting that up, making sure the data is running and monitoring that. But as a writer of the Internet Security Report, he's a great replacement while Mark is out to help us talk about what happened. For new listeners, every quarter WatchGuard releases what we call our Internet Security Report. In the highest level, this is basically a threat intelligence report based on all the quantifiable data we get from all our products, whether they be network security products, endpoint security products, and so on. And the point is simply to kind of see what attackers are doing in a quantifiable way by monitoring actual attacks out there, so that we can kind of give you an idea of what new attacks or what changes and evolutions to attacks are happening, so that you can adjust your defenses in the future, which is why we share it every month. This month, since we want to also share some new security news in this podcast too, we're going to go through some of the highlights. So know you can get all of these details in our security report. You can find it by going to secplicity.org and checking out the threat research, or you can also find it on WatchGuard's pages if you look up Internet Security Report. But first, we're going to dive into a lot of details in different sections, but to share the top highlights, the good news is the volume of threats we saw in Q2 is down pretty much everywhere, whether it's endpoint-based malware, network-based malware detection, or network attacks, network exploits and IPS signatures. The pure volume of these threats that we're blocking is down, suggesting the volume of attacks is down. That said, I think there's some signs you hear about as me and Trevor talk about it, that doesn't mean the sophistication or the level of threat is down. At the very least, malware is continuing to be evasive. One of the highlights that Trevor will cover is a lot of malware is trying to evade detection using encrypted connections, and we'll talk about that percentage later. Also, some interesting things we'll cover is SCADA, if you haven't heard of that acronym, stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition, and they're tools that usually manufacturing, industrial control, and critical infrastructure use to kind of monitor those operational technologies. We saw a particular SCADA threat in our network attack section. We also saw a lot of document threats. But rather than sharing all of this, the highlights, let's dive into some of the details. So the first section we'll cover that's in the report is something we call the Firebox Feed section. And this section covers the attacks we see from our network security gear. So we sell a Firebox and network security services to protect you. And everything here is from the network security services as opposed to endpoint stuff. And with that, the first thing we cover is malware. So Trevor, why don't I just hand it off to you to talk about some of the malware highlights from Q2?
Sure. So the malware, which as Corey mentioned, which is part of the Firebox, the physical fireboxes that are going to be scanning for the traffic. And so these devices are going to be sending us reports that is entailing any type of file that is incoming or just basically caught by a proxy on the Firebox. And so some of the highlights here is that the total malware.
I guess it might be worth get to total malware, but it might be worth separating the different. We have different engines to catch malware. So total malware, you're going to combine the total results, but I think you have some details about some of the different types of ways we catch malware with the Firebox.
Absolutely, yeah, and each service that is running on the Firebox is going to catch different types of malwares, and I'm going to try and explain some of this, and and as quickly as I can while I go down this. But the total malware that we see is down actually 15.7%, and that is the GAV, Gateway Antivirus, which is our basic signature-based malware detection. It's kind of the old school malware detection that'll just quickly, instantly be able to detect whether it's malware or whether it's okay to pass on to the next level.
And it's pattern-based. So the downside, the reason we call GAV and signature-based legacy is it's detection that relies on us already knowing something is bad. So it's not as good at catching brand new malware.
Absolutely, and the upside of it, though, as well, is it's very quick, and so and it's just because of these detections, we can process a significant load on a Firebox without loading it down. APT, and so that the total GAV by itself is 11.7 million, and
that's how many detections we had on Fireboxes. So of all the Fireboxes we get data from, there were 11.7 million detections. I will say, just for new listeners, that does not represent all our customers. All the data we get from Firebox Feed is opt-in. I think there's around 70,000 Fireboxes now that are sharing data with us, but that's still actually a fraction of active customers, which is in the many hundreds of thousands. And on top of that, non-active customers that still have a box. So do know these numbers, even though 11.7 million is large, it actually just represents a small portion of customers that share this data. We encourage you, if you're a Firebox customer, to share this data with us, because it gives us great threat intelligence that we can adjust our security to. So sorry to have interrupted, but that was Gateway Antivirus has about 11.7 million detections, right?
Yes, so Gateway has 11.7 million, and you were right on the number of Fireboxes that we have reporting, just over 70,000. And then we have the APT blocker, and APT blocker works by being able to individually scan and sandbox in a safe environment each individual malware, and once that device is scanned in the sandbox, and to be able to really identify what this program is meant to do. Then
and it's not necessarily malware, right? So what happens with this behavioral protection is malware can be a document, it can be an executable, and of course it goes through our signature protection to very quickly say, oh, this executable, I have no bad signature for it. So that doesn't mean it's not malware. That just means it's not malware we've seen before. But that executable could still be goodware, right? It could be just a normal program you're downloading. So do know we submit all executables and documents. It's not just malware, because we don't know yet, but APT blocker is where we submit any unknown suspicious document or executable for the sandboxing behavioral analysis Trevor was talking about. And that's where we make the decision if it's good or bad.
Right, and we that's a good point. We don't know if it's malware to begin with. So the process essentially is it goes through the GAV, and then it goes through that engine, and then if it doesn't detect if it's that program is malware, then we send it through APT blocker. If that program also doesn't detect that as malware, then we know it's good, and it'll allow it through the perimeter Firebox. So that's how those two services work together. So what we then look at is for the fireboxes that have APT blocker enabled, because not all fireboxes do have them enabled, though we encourage everybody to enable that option because of what we were talking about, how it really identifies more malware than APT. So backing up for devices that have APT blocker, we see that the 0-day percentage, the malware that is caught by APT blocker is 53.1%. So that's down a little bit, but that's still, for those fireboxes, catching more by APT blocker than GAV, indicating that we have more 0-day malware or malware that we haven't seen before than regular basic malware, even that GAV.
Yeah. And to translate that to, that basically means, not to be a sales pitch, but if you're not using advanced malware protection, you're missing a lot. We use Gateway Antivirus because it's useful and it's quick and it's part of our basic security package you can get with our Firebox. But the point is, if you're not using Total Security, which is where you get the additional malware protection like APT blocker and others like Intelligent AV, 53% of the malware we saw got past Gateway Antivirus and is only catchable with APT blocker, or at least was during the time of this report. So you're missing potentially 53% of the malware if you're not using that particular service. And it translates the same to other products too, if you happen not to be a WatchGuard customer. Other projects that have signature-based detection versus behavioral analysis or machine learning detection. If you really want to catch most new malware, that 53% is kind of showing you how much you would miss otherwise.
Absolutely. And on top of the APT blocker that is missing 53, or that is catching the 53%, and a basic GAV is missing that amount, another form that we're seeing is a TLS malware. The TLS malware is the encrypted malware that we see over an HTTPS connection. And this HTTPS connection is for devices that are actually able to scan it. So we're separating the fireboxes that are scanning the HTTPS traffic and devices that aren't. And in the malware that we see, it's actually 81% over an encrypted connection. So for the fireboxes, meaning the fireboxes that are not scanning TLS malware, they're missing 81% of the malware. Now, this is the data that we see. So if you turn on your Firebox to scan the encrypted malware, it may not be the same, but this is what we are seeing for the devices that are reporting.
I think it's a good statistical. Now, what Trevor's basically saying is, unfortunately, not many people turn on a free feature. It comes with every Firebox, whether or not you have our security packages, HTTPS Deep Packet Inspection, or the HTTPS Application Layer Gateway. And the truth is, almost all internet traffic is encrypted nowadays, legit or not legit. Like, there are a few sites that still may use HTTP, but good guys make everything HTTPS because they want to protect people. But guess what? Bad guys love HTTPS too because they know so many people either can't decrypt it or don't turn on this feature. So of the boxes that are decrypting it, when 80% of malware arrives over HTTPS, that means if you're not decrypting HTTPS, you're missing a lot of stuff. There's a good chance all the malware protection may not help you because you're not even applying it to most of the internet traffic that's encrypted. So the takeaway here is bad guys are doing more to evade security controls, and sending malware over a secured web connection is one way they can hide themselves because they know legacy security controls can't deal with it. So like Trevor said, you should turn that sucker on. It's a free feature. Takes a little bit of work, as we've talked about before. Well worth the effort.
Absolutely. And then, so the next point that we want to make here, and for the malware section, is that we are still seeing a lot of Office. If you've seen the previous reports, this is nothing new to actually, but we're continuing, especially in the widespread malware, which is malware that we see more fireboxes see the most of, is going to be the Office documents. So that's something you have to watch out for. You got to make sure that if somebody receives an Office document, whether over email or downloaded off the internet, they're making sure that you are scanning that traffic, make sure you're scanning that file before you open it up. And really, you shouldn't, what do you think, Corey? You probably shouldn't allow macros on
We'll talk about some of the extra things, because training your users on the handling of documents is very important. A lot of people realize executable things might be bad, but they still think documents are benign. So besides all the scanning Trevor talked about, if you open a document and it asks you to enable macros, you probably shouldn't unless you talk to your finance and find out you need them. If you open it and it asks you to, I forget exactly how they put it, but to add editing features or to enable anything, that's a sure sign that it might be something you should avoid doing, especially if it comes from someone you don't know or in an email that seems suspicious. Yeah. The point being, it's a great threat vector for these bad guys, because they know people tend to trust documents more, and that's why you make sure to train your users that documents can be dangerous, whether they're presentations, Word documents, spreadsheets, even rich text documents, as you know from some of our past podcasts, can trigger these vulnerabilities.
And yeah, so all of this information that we have and what we just covered, and it's going to be in our report. One thing that I would like to highlight, though, there is some interesting details in the report. Like one of my favorite jobs here is going over the malware and actually be able to play with the malware, in a safe environment. I'm not going to release it to WatchGuard. Don't worry, Corey. But I'm going to I play with some of the malware, and like one of the ones that I found is actually used to be used by a group called Gothic Panda, which is a group
another name we make fun of. I imagine the emo panda, a really grumpy teenage panda wearing a lot of black, having some earrings, and watching Absolutely. A lot of anime.
That's pretty much. I mean, that's pretty much what we have on the report. We got a little picture that I found there, where it's actually perfect. But this is related. That was originally created, or at least highlighted, used by the group that is related to the Chinese Ministry of State Security, and
so a state-sponsored actor associated with China.
Yeah, APT3 is another name that they have for that group, and they are. This has also been so including the use by this Gothic Panda. And it's also.
And you say this panda because, by the way, there's a ton of APT actors. There's different pandas out there that are all just code names for different state-sponsored groups. Although many of them are Chinese-based, but there's subgroups within China.
Absolutely, and so yeah, that group is using this malware that we actually caught, and then. But the thing is, it's could be used. This is some of the stuff that we kind of make some assumptions on based on what we're able to understand, but it could still be used by this group, the Gothic Panda, or we're also seeing it being used by a Redline password stealer.
Yeah, I asked people to read the report to get the detail, but Trevor goes into a lot of detail, shares some of the scripts, some of the code snippets and things that different threats do. But that is one interesting thing about state-sponsored. This malware sample is associated with state-sponsored actors like that APT group. But the thing is, we also see a lot of these state-sponsored actors using the same exploit kits and malware tools that criminals do. So sometimes it's hard to know for sure if the state-sponsored group group is the one using it, because we sometimes see the payloads that seem more like the criminal group, I think is what you're saying, right, Trevor? So
Absolutely.
It is definitely a threat that's being associated with the APT threat actor. But no, while those threat actors make their own stuff that can be very sophisticated, they're not afraid of using the same freely available stuff, or even stuff that spreads around the underground too. So it's sometimes hard to enumerate them. So that's the great highlights of the malware section. I'm going to do double time to try to get to some of our special guests and news by covering network attacks now. So just so you know, network attacks primarily cover our intrusion prevention service. So obviously this is the service that's designed to catch any network-based software exploit. A lot of people think mostly protecting your servers, but it protects your web clients too. A lot of exploits happen when a client visits a server. And so realize IPS is a two-way connection. The high-level, highlights are, again, network attacks like malware is down. The network attacks dropped about 10% quarter over quarter, just under 10% actually. And it's continuing kind of a downward trend since Q4 last year, which was one of our highs. So it's going down a little bit slowly compared to the high at the end of last year. However, it's also down year over year in this case too. So down 18% compared to Q2 of last year. On average, a Firebox blocked about 55 network attacks per appliance. So down doesn't mean there's not a lot of attacks that your Firebox is blocking, but it just seems like the constant noise of mass scans might be down a little this quarter. Also, interestingly, we also do a regional view sometimes of all these different attacks, whether they be malware or network attacks. And APAC usually seems like the one that's less affected. But more recently, we've started kind of weighting this network attack by how many actual Fireboxes are in the region. For instance, if we sell a lot of these devices in America, obviously it will look like America has the most attacks by volume. But when we weight that by how many devices are actually in each region, APAC, which is the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, we're receiving almost 60%. So the lion's share of these network attacks, with EMEA, I believe, coming in second. As far as the actual top 10 attacks, if you check out our report, we will share what the top 10 network attacks are. But to be honest, it wasn't that much different from the past. So rather than talk about all of them, at the highest level, often these are web-based attacks. So they're attacks that happen to web applications or web clients. I would say, like, of the top 10, 8 were things we saw last quarter, but there were a few new things. One of the most interesting things you should check out in the report is that SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition tool. There's a very specific, we name it in the report, SCADA application that suffered from a relatively old, what's called a directory traversal flaw. That's when you have a web application or interface. Obviously, a visitor should only be able to get to the files on that server associated with the actual web application. But a directory traversal flaw is when there's an issue that they can do something to escape the web directory they're supposed to be limited to and get to other directories on the system. So it's usually an information disclosure and sometimes a code execution flaw, because they can get to directories where they can either increase privilege or grab information they shouldn't have directly associated with the server and not just the web application. And in this case, it was through a web administration interface of a SCADA product. And by the way, it wasn't the only directory traversal flaw. There is a number of other IT products and different directory traversal flaws we saw throughout the quarter too. So, highlights are network attacks are down. If you're a SCADA system, make sure you don't expose web administrative interfaces online, and definitely check out the report for more. The final section in the Firebox feed is something that is basically our DNS security. We have one of our products called DNS Watch that works both on a network and endpoint level, depending on which version you have, and it's called a DNS firewall. So as people click on sites, whether they're going to them on purpose or maybe they accidentally fell for a phish or a malware link, we take over DNS. So when The computer is looking for the actual internet address to go to. If we know it's a bad site, we prevent the user from getting there and instead sinkhole them. And based on that, we get a lot of information for how many phishing domains, malware domains, CNC domains, and also what we call compromised domains, which were legitimate domains that might have been hijacked to do bad stuff. And at the highest level, it's not worth going through all those lists. I think it's better to check out the report where we describe some of the top sites we see in all those lists. But do you know, we blocked about 5.7 million malicious domains from the fireboxes we're watching. It has also decreased about 25%, so it's going down. But there's still millions of domains we're blocking users from accidentally reaching. And there's some interesting legitimate sites that are being used for phishing. So I highly recommend you check out the report. Do you know? Oh, go ahead. Did you want to add something, Trevor?
Just want to add really quick. Just about our DNS watch is that we are able to block applications, not just websites. And so even applications that are accessing, they still go through the DNS. They still and by blocking
applications, you mean, right? Whether you call it a web application, if it's something you access over the web, like Dropbox is a program, an application, but it's all web-based. So that's what you mean by applications, right?
Anything that'll make a DNS request, it's going to do that. Whereas, versus other times where if you were only looking at like a URI, URL, then maybe you're not going to be able to catch every single one. So that's one of the benefits.
There's pros and cons there. Like the benefit is that means that's why we have a endpoint version of DNS Watch. You don't need a Firebox to do this. You can, basically we have a client that will adjust your DNS service on your laptop to do this. And the benefit is you can get this protection anywhere on the world on any device just by we become your DNS server, essentially. The downside to it is it's less granular, right? And that's why the compromised sites are important. One thing that happens is a very legitimate site, like for instance, one specific URI, or in this case, it actually is a URL because it's a web, it's not just a file link or something, on SharePoint can be hijacked. What we see a lot in this report is SharePoint. Bad guys are setting up SharePoint customer accounts and then putting bad stuff on their one public SharePoint link, because when you're a Microsoft customer, you do get a SharePoint.com domain link for some of the stuff you control. The problem with that is with something that's domain-based, we have to block the entire domain or subdomain in order to block it. So DNS Watch is good because it's ubiquitous. You can kind of put it anywhere. But if we have a compromised site, we can't with DNS Watch or with a DNS firewall, you can't point block just one URL of that site. Meanwhile, the other tool, Webblocker does a lot of similar stuff to DNS Watch, right? Webblocker is a tool that as you're visiting sites, not just can we prevent you from going to non-productive sites, but we do have security categories and we can block you from going to the same insecure sites, but it does it, to Trevor's point, by URL. So that means if just one page on New York Times has like a forum comment page on New York Times has been compromised to serve something bad, we can block that one URL on New York Times without blocking every single New York Times URL, period. So slight difference. There's pros to doing it the URL way because you can do it doesn't have to be all or nothing. But DNS watches, the DNS firewall is great because it's just using DNS to provide the security. So it's really easy to put in a lot of places. Cool. Endpoint protection, I'm not going to cover too much. Do you know we have another malware section similar to Trevor's, but this is using our endpoint product. Do you know volume is down, but we're still seeing a lot of interesting attacks? The one part of endpoint protection I'll cover is from an endpoint perspective, we do monitor the different vectors that malware gets in. And there's things like, is it script-based malware? Is it something that's leveraging a flaw in Windows? Is it something that's leveraging a malicious Adobe Acrobat document or a flaw in a browser or in an Office file? Or is it maybe, I think we have a KMS, is it called, version auto KMS, which does it come because of Windows piracy tools online? So that it's very interesting to learn how the malware actually arrives because you can figure out how they're targeting. Are they going after vulnerabilities in your browser, so just your users browsing, or is it something else? And the answer is it is something else. For the past 3 reports, malicious scripts, especially PowerShell, accounts for, this quarter it was 81%, last quarter it was over 80%. Oh, I'm sorry, this quarter it was 80%, last quarter it was over 81%. Malicious scripts are still the most common way malware gets in. You've heard us talk about living off land attacks with PowerShell. I believe that it's because these scripts are some of the evasive tactics, especially when they use living off the land tactics to evade normal security controls by using legitimate scripting language like PowerShell to make themselves harder to find. That said, of the other vectors I talked about, like through Acrobat or Adobe PDFs, browsers, and Office documents, those 3 in particular, which have been low last quarter, did grow a little. So, Trevor mentioned Office documents continue to be a high threat from a network level. While it's not quite as bad as scripts from an endpoint level, Office documents are rising as a vector too. The only last thing I'm not going to cover, because I want to get to some takeaways for this report, is we do have a security story of the month section. This time we went into a lot of technical detail about a threat that was called Folina. It is a Office document-based threat. So it was a new vulnerability affecting Word documents and Office documents that attackers were using in actual live attacks to get malware into systems. So Mark goes into detail on that story, how Folina worked from a very technical level. You should check it out if you want to know more about Office documents. But why don't we skip all the way to takeaways for time's sake? And the whole point of releasing this report, besides sharing the highlights with you, is to kind of have some security defenses that go with it. So one of the things from the report was the fact that we saw some SCADA attacks, some attacks on supervisory control and data acquisition targets. And SCADA is the type of very critical system that, like all industrial control systems in the past, if it's really critical, it should be somehow separated from the internet. You might have heard the term air gap back in the days of critical systems. I think, unfortunately, the air gap is somewhat disappeared. It's not air anymore. You can still kind of segment operational technologies, but unfortunately, I think there's a benefit to networking that even smart electrical grids and other things get. So while the air gap has disappeared, one of our takeaways is you should be segmenting your network, especially if you're an industrial control network. A SCADA system shouldn't be part of the normal business network where all your users are. It should be segmented from the business network. Furthermore, the actual operational technology of the network that has all the specialized equipment, if you're an industrial control system, should probably be segmented from SCADA with only limited access between to kind of add extra security. You've heard us talk about zero trust. This kind of follows the zero trust segment. Even within your trusted organization, you should have gateways and segments of information where you can apply security controls between all those networks. Long story short, SCADA should never be directly connected to the internet. There should be something in between. And while I used industrial control networks as a reason for doing segmentation, this segmentation and zero trust tip applies to every business out there. You may not have operational technology in SCADA, but you have something that's the most important keys to your kingdom. It could be your source code servers. It could be your Active Directory. So in the same way that industrial control folks put segments between these different critical networks, you should put segments between different trust levels of your network. Absolutely. Anything to add there, Trevor?
I think you got it. As far as the segmentation, this is all part of a layered defense here.
Absolutely.
And part of this layered defense, it's the segmentation and then scanning the traffic, and including scanning the traffic between areas of your network that are less trusted. In the past, they were called, demilitarized zones.
DMZ.
Now we're talking about segmentation between each networks, between SCADA and between less trusted networks.
And I would say today should even have many. The DMZ was kind of giving a slightly public network from a not at all public network. But nowadays you should have, how you segment by trust should be more granular than it used to be with the old DMZ. You can do it by department, you can do it by trust, but it makes the most sense by value of data. The most important stuff should be the most the stuff you want to segment for. As more and more people are allowed to access the data, you can have less protections but segment the trusted stuff.
And ideally, ultimately the goal is to have each group of people on the network, each subnet even, to only be able to access the things that they are required. That is the ultimate goal. Sometimes it's a little more practical today than others. But when you're talking about separating these networks, you want to be able to scan the traffic between these networks as well, so that we're not getting exploits being what's called using steps to kind of grow inner circles of these networks.
Yeah. It's not separation just for the separation's sake. It's because there will be stuff you allow through those networks, but the goal is by putting a gateway there, by putting subsegment, not only can you limit what's allowed with access control lists, but to your point, all the services we talked about that protect you from malware, from network attacks, you have yet another gateway where you can apply that scanning that you're talking about, right? So it's Absolutely. Not just scanning stuff from the internet, it's scanning between all these segments too.
Yep, and by scanning this traffic, you're able to separate these segments while still allowing those who need to access the services access. And most of these services are going to be on TLS. This type of encryption that we see, that if you are best practices for a company is all services are going to be on TLS, and so we want to be able to scan that traffic. And when we see that 81% of our traffic, based on the feed data, is going to be TLS traffic, TLS, not TLS encrypted traffic, let me back that up, but the malware is going to be encrypted.
I'm sure our audience knows this, but TLS, transport layer security, it's what's taken over from SSL. And basically, anytime you encrypt web-based traffic, TLS is what's used, and other types of traffic too. So TLS is just the default encryption we use for most web applications and other things.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. And so we definitely want to be able to scan that, because what we're seeing is that if we are not scanning the TLS traffic, then we're missing 81% of the malware.
Correct. The last two tips I'll share really quickly is don't expose management interfaces. For the love of goodness gracious, don't expose management interfaces. This is also SCADA related, but when I talked about some of the network attacks, a lot of these directory traversal attacks, besides the SCADA interface, it was in other IT products, and it was all in their web management interface. When you have a software service nowadays, most of them are these web-based applications, and the way you as an administrator manage them is through a special URL that gets you to the web administrative portal. And by web administrative, that means only administrators should be accessing that. You might have to expose your website to the internet, but you do not want to expose the web administrative portal of any software, hardware product to the internet ever. Yes, remote management is something you need to do. There's lots of different ways, as you've heard us talk about before, like VPN with MFA and other techniques, where you can, in a more limited fashion, still access these web administrative portals remotely. But the SCADA issue, the SCADA flaw we saw being attacked, and all the other directory traversal attacks were in web administrative interfaces that never should be exposed to the internet in the first place. So don't do that. And the final tip, I think we've kind of covered it, Trevor, but documents. From an endpoint level, from a network level, from the story of the month with Folina, documents are definitely a vector bad guys are using as a way to trick your users into accidentally interacting with malicious content. You need to train your users. Make sure your security awareness training has something specific, making sure people know, hey, documents aren't just text. Documents can be malicious. If you get them in email, if you get them over the web, as Trevor mentioned, whether they're from someone you don't know, you should definitely be skeptical and suspicious. But even if they appear to be from someone you know, but you never expected them, make sure they know that they should be suspicious of documents. If they weren't expecting it, they should verify before touching it. And if they do open that document, if it starts to ask for additional permissions or other things, whether that be macros or to enable editing or whatever, realize there's risk there, and maybe that's where you stop if you haven't already verified the document. So train on that. So that's the Internet Security Report. Now let's go ahead and transition to a abbreviated news section. But before me and Trevor dive into a few news stories, last week we covered the Optus breach, and I mentioned that we might be able to get an Australian local to talk about the Optus breach. There have been some updates for that. So let's quickly cut to an interview I had with Dean Calvert talking about some additional news on the Optus breach. Last week we talked about the Optus data breach that affected a lot of Australian customers, but we of course are just reporting on the news remotely, so we thought it would be fantastic to get a local cybersecurity and technology expert to join us and one of WatchGuard's partners. So I would love to introduce Dean Calvert. Hey Dean, nice to have you on the show.
G'day Corey, good to be with you, and welcome everybody else.
Yeah. So Dean, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And of course, you're a partner of WatchGuard, so MSP and IT partner. We'd love to hear about Calvert Technologies and you.
Yeah, so we're a managed service provider based in Adelaide, South Australia, which if you look at a map of Australia and see the leg at the bottom, we're down just to the east of that. It's the wine capital of the world. And we've been looking after businesses throughout South Australia and the Northern Territory for the past 27 years. Well, sometimes it feels like 1 year, 27 times over, the way things have been changing. And we've been a WatchGuard partner now for, I think, about 6 years. And it's been a really good relationship for us too. So the technology is great and working with the people is great. And getting to spend time with Pop Corey every once in a while too is not too bad.
Yeah, it kind of sucks that we're kind of on a video call instead of in person. I miss Australia and seeing you and others there. Not to mention, I mean, this is kind of off topic, and I'm going to say it wrong on purpose because I didn't know about the difference, but I've been kind of a fan from afar that you're a gyrocop, not just a pilot, which I want to be one day, but a gyrocopter or something else pilot. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm a gyroplane instructor. There's, I think, only 30 or 31 of us in the entire country. So it's a pretty elite group. And a gyroplane looks like a helicopter, but it flies like an aeroplane. A gyrocopter, if you look up Igor Benson gyrocopter, you'll see what they are. It's almost like a chair with an engine behind it and a rotor wing above. And that's a trademark for that particular product, whereas a gyroplane is the correct term. So they are very cool. And when you come down to Australia, I'll be sure to take you up. But if anybody wants to see some awesome photos and videos, just look up Rotor Sport, rotor-sport.com.au. And if you're ever down in Adelaide, come for a fly. It's the most fun you can have.
It seems awesome. I know some people might be nervous about that, but I would take you up on that in a second. I'm also a RC enthusiast, and there's a guy named Peter Schreipel that I probably should have known gyroplane because I think he made a homemade RC version of a gyroplane, which actually took him a while. It has very interesting dynamics about, how you have to design it to fly forward and up. Cool stuff. Well, let's get to Optus. Before we start, I'd love to engage some of your local intelligence of what's going on in your local knowledge, but there have been a few quick updates since last week, so I just want to share them with the audience really quick. First, last week we shared that Optus hadn't fully shared how many of the customers were affected when we first recorded our podcast, but since then, of their approximate 9.9 million active customers, they say there were 2.2 million affected accounts. So 7.7 million accounts weren't affected, but 2.2 million had some sort of personal number like an ID, a Medicare ID, personal ID, or PII stolen. Of that 2.2 million, 1.2 million is actual active customers. But we did last week talk about the fact that they have expired there's customers that have left Optus. Apparently 900,000 of those 2.2 million are not current Optus customers. They're expired users. So I find it interesting, Dean, because I do know that they're informing the 1.2 million customers that they know are affected directly. And I think you probably have laws that require that. But according to something Singtel released, which is they're the owner of Optus, apparently, a Singaporean company, they haven't confirmed how they're going to contact the expired customers which were affected. Anyways, I have other updates to share, but do you have any thoughts on that? Anything you've heard on your side, or the difference between, actively telling active customers, but how these non-active customers right now may be unprotected or not knowing if they're affected?
Yeah, look, there's been mixed. It's been one of the biggest stories in the news over here, other than the flooding hitting the eastern states. And there's been mixed feedback from people. I've heard from existing Optus customers that they've been complaining about the lack of communication. So I think there's probably a measured difference in terms of what they are reporting and how much they're saying, because it's an ongoing active investigation. The Australian Federal Police are involved as well. So I figure there's probably going to be some holding back of information while they undergo the investigation. But some of the frustrations are people having to line up for hours and hours to go to one of the service centres to get a new driver's license or Medicare card or passport. And they all contribute to your points of identification if you're opening up a bank account somewhere. So you really want to protect that information. And so there's a guy that I cycle with, and he had to line up to get his driver's license replaced the other day. And fortunately, it didn't take him too long, but there's certainly been complaints, people calling in on the radio. They've been having to line up for hours and hours and hours to deal with it. I believe Optus have said that they will make good on paying for replacement passports and driver's licenses, etc. So there's no financial outlay for the people, but there's still the inconvenience that's happening. I think this is the biggest cybersecurity incident we've had in the country.
Oh, wow. And yeah, to your point, by the way, another update, this will probably be a big bill for Singtel and Optus. Right now, estimates, which I think they base the estimates mostly on, there's average costs per record lost. I think in the US and Australia, it's anywhere from $110 to $150 is what you should expect your corporate loss per every personal record you lose of someone. So as you mentioned, the good news is Optus is doing the ID services, offering to pay for the ID protection services, offering to pay for passport replacements. But right now, it sounds like people are estimating their breach bill, how much they have to pay for this breach, might be $420 million. So definitely a big one. Another, by the way, Deloitte is leading their forensic review, so still an investigation. Maybe we'll learn more. One of the things that's interesting is in Singtel's statement, and one of the things Singtel said is they said they claim it's still unclear how the intrusion occurred. This is weird to me because I think we already know the API rumors, and even the hacker themselves apparently has confirmed API was how it happened. But you had a little more information or things that are being spoken about the API being potentially the root cause there. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the theories that we've had going around is that it was a test environment. And so one of the capabilities, if you've got your phone and you want to know how much data you've used in the month, you can open up a little app on your phone and it will query an API and come back and say you've used 50% or 60% of your data. And it was that type of thing, I believe, where they plugged in a phone number and it would return the customer information unauthenticated. And what apparently tripped them up is that they pulled out the data at a high rate. So they started plugging in more numbers and this data would come out.
They being the attacker, maybe.
Yes. And because they were doing this at such a high rate, pulling the data out, that's what actually signaled the attack happening. Well, I don't even know if you'd call it an attack. It's more like an intrusion attempt. And so it was because of that high data rate that they actually got tripped up and caught. So if they'd slowed down the amount of data that they were extracting, they may have been able to go on for a lot longer and get more data. Again, that's one of the stories. So as a test environment with the unauthenticated API, which just makes you shake your head. I mean, the second biggest telco in the country, and they have this happening. It's just, how does that happen these days?
Yeah, I will say that one of the things you added just now that is new is the security industry had already been talking about the API issue being potentially it, and talking about it seemed very 101, unauthenticated thing connected to a database where just a mobile number gets you that information. But the test, the fact that the new bit of information is maybe the test account accounts for why they hadn't put security controls in yet. But then you have to question, why are they using the test API so publicly? That's something that should be tested internally first. So definitely interesting. While we're talking about I'll give you my opinion, Dean, is I won't immediately judge a company, a vendor, a big company for having a data breach. I believe it's not a matter of if, it's when that every company one day will suffer an incident of some sort. It's not because they're not doing protection, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't do protection. It just means, you won't plug every hole. So I won't immediately hate a company just because they had a cybersecurity incident, but I think how we judge them is, one, how they handle it once they learn, how they are transparent with their customers, how they take care of it after. And two, one of the reasons we look at root cause is there's some attacks that are sophisticated, and you can understand why maybe they didn't do perfect defense, but they did a lot of defense. And there's some attacks that you start to talk about negligence. This is almost like they weren't even trying.
What do you think? If you're going to start up a test environment, why not have dummy data behind it initially until you've actually gone through and locked everything down?
Yeah, and you could access list it to just be accessible to people you're testing with. So a lot you could do. But it brings up one of the new things that came out in an article I read, which in one of, Singtel and Optus are reacting to media for this. And in one of, I think it was actually a earnings call, where Singtel made a statement they're going to vigorously defend against class actions because of this Optus breach. And the comment in the article is like, on your earnings call talking about vigorously defending against class actions, when you really should be talking about how you're going to help your customers, how you're going to solve the problem, make sure doesn't happen again. So I guess what I'm getting at is those are probably most of the updates, but to your talking points, how do you feel Optus and Singtel are handling this, or how does the Australian population? Do you think it's a good example of like breach response, or it sounds like some of the things you said, maybe the Australian population doesn't think so?
Yeah, look, from what I've been hearing around from people is that they haven't been handling it well, that the communication's not been great. And yeah, really it is, as you said, it's when things go wrong, that's when you can show your true mettle. So if you go to a restaurant and the meal gets wrong, it's how they actually address that and fix it for you. That can be the difference between whether you go back there or not.
Yeah.
I'm sure Optus will lose customers over this. And really, I understand that there'll be limits in what they can say because there's an ongoing active investigation with the Australian Federal Police. They need to not only advise the customers of what they can, but they need to continue to investigate exactly how this happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. So yes, there'll be limits in what they can say, but even coming out and saying, look, we're still working through this, we don't have more information we can give you that we would like to, just something like that would be beneficial, particularly to the Optus customers. I mean, my son and his wife are caught up in this. They're Optus customers. I'm not sure if their data has been leaked as part of this. It makes me realize I need to give them a call and check on them. But yeah, it's the communication feedback has been what I've been hearing from others, that it hasn't been brilliant.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing I would love to learn, we just talked about how they know 1.2 million of their active customers are affected, but they also know 7.7 aren't. And it's just relatively recently during this week, we learned how many were actually affected. I wonder if some companies, yes, it's good that they're telling the 1.2 that you are affected, but I wonder if it would avoid confusion of also communicating to all the non-affected customers just so they get that confirmation. Theoretically, you could say, if I haven't got an email from Optus, I'm probably not affected because they say they've communicated to the affected folks. But I think it's still nice for the non-affected people to get that email, hey, we have found that you are not in that affected list, so that maybe some of the confusion is they didn't get the email because they weren't affected, but that may not be enough. They may be still wondering because of all the headlines. You mentioned the AFP, the Australian Federal Police. By the way, just for a practical tip, I do know one update this week is the Australian Federal Police have warned your citizenship that, they are starting to see phishing and SMS attacks using this Optus information and Optus story as a kind of a lure to get people to do things. So be aware of that. But they seem to be, just because I've worked with some of the U.S. authorities before, it seems like government authorities, at least for big breaches, are getting more involved in investigation. Do you have any thoughts or knowledge of how the AFP and other Australian authorities are doing in this breach?
Look, no real specifics, but I do know that the Australians are very good when it comes to this sort of cyber activity. If you recall the Anom app that was being used for encrypted messages between criminals, that was actually developed by the Australian Federal Police. So they are at the cutting edge of these sort of cyber incidents. Fortunately, I haven't had to look over my shoulder to worry about them following me around. If I see them, I just say, I know Pop Corey, and they leave me alone. It's all okay.
They're probably following me around too.
So, yeah, look, I think they're doing a good job, but there's only so much information that they can be giving out. And particularly, you mentioned about the class actions. I'm aware of 2 law firms that are looking to bring up class action lawsuits against it. So probably with that in mind as well, the AFP will be buttoning down in terms of restricting the information that goes out until they're dead certain of everything.
One thing we do see in Five Eyes countries like Australia and others, and us, of course, is I've noticed federal government not only actively working more with private companies in situations like this, but working with the Five Eyes, with friendly nations. I hear at least that the AFP and the FBI are sharing information about this breach. So just knowing other, authorities in other places are sharing threat intel to help find things. We always have to question, I think in any democracy, we want checks and balances around the power of federal authorities, not because we don't trust them, but because you don't want a dictator to suddenly be in office. But I think they've been doing a good job with private-public communication lately. I think another question I had is, while we're talking about practical tips like watch out for phishing, one of the things we mentioned was, something affected customers definitely should do is consider this data is out there that's usually used for opening accounts and other things. And things you can do there's ID theft protection services, and I think Optus will pay for some, and there's probably some Australian ones. But I know very well how credit freezes work in the US, and I actually, here we can do indefinite freezes, which is something I've kind of chosen to do because of how bad data leaks have been lately. But what are some of the specifics about what you can do if you're an affected customer to protect your identity, knowing that these cards are out there in Australia?
Yeah, so there's 3 credit reporting agencies in Australia. I know one of them is Equifax. I just don't remember the name of the other 2. Yeah. But you only need to let one of them know about freezing your credit capability, and they will let the others know. But you've got 21 days, so you can't do an indefinite freeze. It's a 21-day hold, and then it gets released. I believe there may be some special circumstances where you can extend it, but it would be a good idea if you are affected just to get in touch with one of the 3 credit reporting agencies, get them to put a hold on your ID until you can change your Medicare and driver's license, etc. One of the interesting things came out of this, all but 2 of the states in Australia have implemented additional security with driver's licenses. So you get a driver's license number and you have that for life, but on the back of the driver's license card, there's actually a card number, which only gets changed when you renew your driver's license. So if they've got the front number, that's not everything that you need in order to use your driver's license as ID for opening up bank accounts, etc., for credit cards, unless you happen to be in, I think it's Victoria and Queensland, where they haven't enacted that legislation to allow the use of this number on the back. So that may actually help change things for those states where they will realize that they need to step up the security for just something as simple as a driver's license. The other thing I've noticed, just a little practical tip, when I went and had a financial advisor help with setting up some superannuation, which for you guys is a 401k, and he wanted to take photographs of ID for the purposes of setting things up. And I just went, no, if you're going to use your phone to take photos of my ID, how do I know that you're not going to get hacked? So what I did is I provided him with a secure link to download those images rather than going to his phone.
That's excellent.
Yeah, so that's just a tip. If you're going somewhere, going to a hotel and they want to get a copy of your driver's license or passport, you say, well, what are you going to do with it and how are you going to store it? You've got to be vigilant about those sorts of things.
I think it's solved for passports. This is kind of an aside, but to your point, I think here in the US, it's social security numbers, which have nothing digital. They're still these paper cards you can easily use in just a number. And driver's licenses and passports are big pieces of ID that are often used to confirm your identity, which means people can often open accounts if they have that information. But here in the US for passports, it's probably the same in Australia for passports. The good news is it's no longer just the number. They have what they call biometric ones, which actually have a little chip in there. So you have a private digital certificate attached to you, which, I know there's some people that worry about shipping babies, and that's not what we want to do. This isn't, what do they call it, the sign of the devil or whatever. We're not shipping babies, but having that digital certificate and chip be part of a passport, but hopefully extending that to things like driver's license, to Medicare cards, to social security numbers if we continue to use them in the US. Obviously, the human readable number is easy to leak and has leaked too much. And the way it is today, I would never use a social security number or a driver's license without a chip as a form of ID, because how can you? That can be stolen and copied. But if you actually have a digital chip that's assigned, basically it's a private public key crypto that they use to support this, then you have your own private key and it's not as easily stolen. So hopefully all nations will start to add some digital certificates, digital keys, private keys to all of their forms of identification.
New South Wales implemented a digital driver's license, and so on your phone, it's there are particular things that you can show up to use that as identification confirmation, but it's digital, and so I think that's something that we should have.
And it sounds like maybe those two locations in Australia do have that, which is great. Well, I guess great update. It's awesome to have a local perspective. Before we drop off and let you have your day back, Dean, is there anything we missed or anything you'd want to add about the Optus breach or anything else?
No, well, I guess it just goes to show that the big organizations can be just as badly affected as small organizations. One of the things that I have conversations with customers and prospects where they're small business, and they go, well, I'm only a small business. Why would they come after me? I haven't got anything that they would value. And I just shake my head and I just say, is you value your data. They value your money. And so they're betting the fact that if they can block you from accessing your data or threaten to leak it, they're betting on the fact that you will pay money to stop it leaking or to get access back to it. And really, that's the mindset to take. It's not that you've got data they want, you've got the money. That's what they want. So everybody is at risk and everyone needs to remain vigilant.
Money or a resource. I would even add to that we're finding beyond the fact that even if you're a small company and they don't care about your company, they can just ransom you for some value. The other thing is that I think people forget this digital supply chain we all live in. There's no company, big or small, that doesn't have connection to other companies, whether we buy or render services from others, bring contractors in. One day we may learn that this Optus API was something done by a third-party contractor or something, you know what I mean? So you may be a tiny, small, 5-person development house doing contract API work for big companies, and you end up being the one that causes by the way, I'm not saying that's the case for this, but it's another example of why the size of your company doesn't matter. You offer value and resource to any attacker just based on having money and having any computing resource. Plus, maybe they don't care about you directly, but if you work with any partners that they do care about, you may be the one they target in order to get into a partner too. So I'm with you. SMBs, small businesses are equally, I would almost say they're bigger targets nowadays, because I believe the attackers have realized they tend to be the lower hanging fruit.
Yeah, easy to get. And also just, with your family, if you've got older people in your family, people even older than you, Corey, and they get targeted. And so, you're going to have people's parents and grandparents, they'll be targeted. They may get text messages or emails just to say that they've been caught up in it, even if they're not in this case, an Optus customer. But if there's someone else, they get confused and they can fall for these things. So, if you're out there, talking to family and friends, just make them aware. Don't fall for these things. Be that crack in the record, repeating it time and again. I've put it into my parents and my in-laws and an extended family. If in doubt, check with me. And I'm always happy when they do check with me about these things. So, remain vigilant about that too.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dean. Thank you for starting your day on Thursday. It's so weird. I'm talking to you in the future right now, but I guess I'm used to that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Corey.
So that was a great segment with Dean. But guess what? I recorded that yesterday, and there's been yet another Optus update that I really quickly want to share before Trevor and I jump into a couple other stories. So since me and Dean talked, news came out today that the AFP, that's the Australian Federal Police, arrested a 19-year-old in association with this Optus breach. Now, this 19-year-old is not the person that did the breach, not the original attacker who first leaked the data. But as it turns out, this 19-year-old was someone that took the 10,000 files we mentioned that were leaked. They used the contents and phone numbers and contents, private information of those files. He started sending SMS phishes, which is called smishing, to the actual victims themselves, extorting them that he would leak their data to everyone if they didn't pay about 2,000 Australian dollars. So this is just some kid that was taking advantage of the leaked data to try to extort other folks. Good news is the Australian police have arrested him. He's being charged with a telecommunication issue. It's basically using telecommunication networks with intent to blackmail is illegal, with penalties up to 10 years in prison. And they have private or personal information or PII handling laws that basically is in violation of how you have to handle people's personally identifiable information. In that particular law is punishable up to 7 years. So you might have remembered Dean and I mentioned you should be on the lookout for phishing and SMS messages taking advantage of this. This is why this kid was caught doing just that. Good news that they caught them. So happy about that. But the only additional takeaway we want to add to that story is keep your eye out for more phishing SMS. That data's out there. Bad guys are going to leverage this to try to get more from their victims. But
Corey, I just wanted to add one quick point. The way that they caught him was he actually decided to create a bank account and pointed people to that bank account. And
this guy's OPSEC was silly. In a day of cryptocurrency, when how bad guys can extort people is pretty hard. This teenager, wow, not very, OPSEC, by the way, is operational security. It means he made a very stupid mistake that easily got him caught. By the way, also stupid idea to do. I mean, he got this 10K records from a well-known underground we know, and even that underground decided to remove the records and didn't want to touch it because it knew the authorities would be all over it. So just the idea that he was going to do something that was already a big story that authorities were all over, kind of a silly move by him. So happy they caught him. That said, Trevor, let's go on to two quick stories that I do want to cover. One, we did not cover last week because we record at a certain time the week before, but this actually happened the week we record. So it's something that could have been in last year's podcast, but we missed the story because it just came out at the end. And the story I'm talking about is a set of Exchange vulnerabilities that is colloquially known as ProxyNotShell. You might have heard this by now, but at the end, 2 weeks ago, last Friday, news of zero-day Exchange vulnerabilities came to light. I think it was because a Asia-Pacific security researcher released it, and then Microsoft came out with a quick warning about it as well. At the highest level, the researcher found two new zero-day, that means unpatched by Microsoft, vulnerabilities that affected primarily on-premise Exchange servers. And the two vulnerabilities, one's called a server-side request forgery. Not going to go into detail on this shorter news story of what that is, but it's very similar to, client-side request forgeries and cross-sites. It's a way to be able to spoof a response as though you are the server back to a client. But that flaw combined with another remote code execution type flaw that an authenticated attacker, someone that had an account of some sort, didn't have to be privileged, but had an account on the Exchange server, could basically combine these flaws to execute code on your Exchange server. And what these threat actors, this was a live attack. This was found happening in the wild by live attackers. What they were doing with this was installing web shells, and then often installing DLLs with those web shells that they could then execute in memory of the Exchange server to gain full control of the Exchange server and do other bad stuff. So you might remember an old Exchange attack called ProxyShell. It is very similar in concept, but they call it ProxyNotShell because it's different. As I mentioned, it's being exploited in the wild. It seems to be state-sponsored attackers, so it's being exploited in a limited fashion, but it is by the most sophisticated attackers out there, so something to watch out for. I feel like there's a little good news here in that it requires authentication, which mitigates it a little. But I think you all know how easy credential theft has been lately. So when state-sponsored attackers can get credentials so quickly and easily, it is a big deal if someone does have authentication on your Exchange server. Does not affect the cloud. If you're fully cloud M365 and Outlook and Exchange, you're fine. But I would say a lot of bigger organizations still have on-premise servers. There's a hybrid mode that includes on-premise servers. You would still be affected. And by the way, there is no patch for this. So the second part of the story is the warning, what should you do about this? Do you know Microsoft has published a mitigation for this when it first came out? The mitigation was this kind of what they call a URL rewrite instruction. So a special instruction you could do that I think Trevor might talk a little about in a second. But beyond making sure that it closed down the PowerShell ports necessary for some of this attack to work, it basically was changing something. It was rewriting a URL that might have been a maliciously crafted URL so that it should have defanged this. Now, unfortunately, a few days later, this week, actually, researchers, including Kevin Beaumont, who some of you may know, found that there was easy ways to bypass Microsoft's original mitigation. By the way, did you have something on that, Trevor?
Yeah, I can go really quick on this. I looked a little bit on this mitigation process, and originally it would just a very simple one line rule that you can implement in Exchange. That is a request URI rule that basically deny this. Well, they were able to figure out a way around it, and by doing some URL encoding. And that's, I believe, what Kevin Beaumont found. And so Beaumont, and so basically they changed this in just the last 2-3 days, I believe. And so we want to make sure that you have the latest mitigation strategy from Microsoft on this. But what's interesting is it uses a name that I've seen before, auto discover. And so the Exchange auto discover process works by allowing clients to auto discover the domains that they are on. It's not the most, imagine that, it's not the most secure. And so it uses auto discover and exploits it in some manner that, unfortunately, I wish I had more details, but it exploits it in some manner, and it maybe allows a PowerShell script to run. So that was, I thought, was interesting as far as the mitigation process that they used. You can sometimes tell about how the exploit works.
And it's interesting. I mean, like you said, the mitigation was essentially looking for all a web server, like Exchange, Outlook, Exchange, besides being an email server, is a web server because that's how Outlook Web Access works and how a lot of stuff works nowadays. So the URL rewrite rule is basically looking, web servers just get lots of little posts to them with URLs with parameters in them asking them to do something, whether it's a post or a get. And these rules just kind of, hey, I want to look for a pattern that I know is this bad guy doing something, and I'm just going to block that pattern. But I found it interesting that HTML encoding, the side effect of that is there's 100 encoding methods allow you to write HTML, write URIs in all kinds of different ways, or encode data in lots of different ways. So if your pattern is just looking for one simple way to do things and it doesn't take into account different ways you can encode syntax, you can say the same thing in a parameter, but it's encoded in a different way that doesn't make the same pattern, it's pretty easy to bypass rules. So I'm glad that researchers caught it. I'm glad that Microsoft updated mitigations. Before we get into, I think you know some of the mitigations, but how severe do you really think this is, Trevor? I mean, I think it's a big deal vulnerability, but the authentication part of it, should most people be worried about that if they're doing any authentication security?
Well, so if you have Exchange exposed, which a lot of groups do, a lot of times it's very difficult to actually have an on-premise Exchange server that doesn't have access to the internet on
at least on the ports that you require. I mean, you definitely need port 25, but you might also need some of these API other ports that Exchange uses for things like Outlook Web Access, and yep. I bet even integrations require those PowerShell ports sometimes.
Yeah, and so then basically part of this exploit allows any user to run a PowerShell command. You don't need, and the mitigation for this, by the way, is to only allow admins to run PowerShell. And so currently it appears that any user who has login is able to use this exploit to run PowerShell commands. So you're relying on anybody that has
run PowerShell commands with privilege higher than them even, right?
Right. And so basically you're saying that you want to make sure that any user who has access to your Exchange, whether it's a admin or a regular user, is going to make sure that they have a good password policy. And as much as I would love to hear that everybody uses a password manager and uses 24 character long passwords on every single little thing they use, it's just not the case. And so a random 24 character password.
That'd be even better.
So that would be better. But the problem is that's not the case. So
unless you have the password manager, that's why you should use it. That's the only time a human could actually keep up with that crap.
Exactly. And so, yeah, as far as the authentication requirements, there is a small, but just a small step. As far as authentication.
In other words, it's a severely critical vulnerability if someone can get a valid credential or authentication to an account that's on your Exchange server. I will say, besides the password manager, if all your users have good password security, you do make it harder for them to be authenticated. MFA though works too. Make sure, even if some state-sponsored actor is able to sneak a credential from someone, if you have multi-factor authentication, that's another roadblock you can put in front of them. But really, you want to fix this. So what are the real takeaways? Well, if you hadn't heard about the fact that their original mitigation doesn't quite work, make sure to see Microsoft's latest release, which has updated mitigation steps. That will not fix the problem entirely. That should just prevent it from being exploited, hopefully. So the bigger tip is when this comes out on Monday, I believe Patch Tuesday will be the following day. Pay close attention to Patch Tuesday. They haven't said exactly when the patch will come out, but they have said they accelerated it. So I kind of expect the patch to be tomorrow. If it's not tomorrow, I expect them to actually probably do an out-of-cycle patch. But keep track of this and patch it the second Microsoft releases it. So that was one of the stories. The other story, which I might cover again with Mark too, but in a few podcasts ago, and in many podcasts before this, we've been covering basically the drama around an old Uber breach. I believe it was all the way back in 2014. I might have covered in one of my weekly security reviews that I used to do on YouTube. Uber suffered basically a breach that had access, that gave people access to a lot of Uber customer data. But we didn't learn about the breach in 2014. We learned about it years later because Uber as an organization did not release detail about it. And it was because apparently the CSO was being blamed for the cover-up. The CSO was accused of keeping this breach from lower Uber employees It's still unclear to me if other executives, other C-level executives knew or not. I do not know. And I've only read the ruling on the case so far. I haven't been able to follow the 4-week trial that has been happening the past 4 weeks. But long story short, if you heard us talk about whether the CSO should be the one accountable, definitely if he did it, if the CSO covered it up all by himself, he definitely should be accountable. But I had some questions of if other executives knew. But despite my questions, a federal jury found Joe Sullivan, the ex-CSO of Uber. And of course, by the way, before Uber, he was also a prosecutor for the Department of Justice. He was a CSO for Facebook and Cloudflare. Very well-known security person. He was found guilty of 2 felonies after the 4-week trial that just happened. And these felonies have criminal charges. So this does mark the first time a CSO or CSO has directly faced criminal charges over lack of incident response for an organization. The jury found them guilty of both obstruction. This was a charge against the FTC that they claimed that them covering it up prevented the FTC from being able to investigate this breach because they didn't even know about it. And also the weird word me and Mark talked about before, misprision. It's hard for me to pronounce that word. It's like prison and together. But misprision essentially means the deliberate concealment of one's knowledge of either a treasonable act or a felony. So he was hiding a felony. Now, by the way, there was at least one other person that knew of this. An attorney at the company also knew of this attack. So apparently the attorney helped do the payment. There, you remember in the last podcast, besides covering this up, this particular CSO also paid the hackers because they were extorting the company. And he set up a bug bounty system to have an excuse to try to pay them, but the attorney helped transfer cryptocurrency and pay them. The attorney, while they obviously knew, they had immunity and testified against Sullivan, so really the CSO was the only person held accountable. Sentencing hasn't happened for this. For these charges, Sullivan can face anywhere from 8 years in prison and have up to $500,000 in fines. So that's a big deal. So I guess the talking points is it's definitely clear Sullivan is in part culpable to this for sure. I mean, he's definitely ruled guilty by a jury of peers. He did do a cover up to normal employees, but what do you think about this, Trevor? One of the things Mark and I talked about is I am not 100% sure if it was him covering it up alone or if at the time the other executives at Uber also knew. And the reason that was relevant to me, just before you share your thoughts on it, is even though a CSO is in charge of security, if my CEO and group of executives disagree with how I'm going to handle something, ultimately, I'm not in charge. The CEO has last word in all things. So there's something I can do as a CSO if I think it's totally wrong. I can resign. But my worry is that other C-levels knew, and if other C-levels know, should only the CSO be accountable. Do you have any thoughts on the ruling or any of that, Trevor?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with you. I going into the story at the beginning, I read it as it could have been just the CSO talking with somebody who found an exploit, trying to look for money. And I think we've seen that before, where they're coming in and they're like, "Hey, here's an exploit that I found. Give us more money," But as you look into it more, that's just simply not the case.
No, either way, the CSO he is involved in a cover-up no matter what. So I agree with you. This is a cover-up no matter how you look at it.
And yeah, so in this case here, it's pretty clear. And I think this guy, of anybody, but first being the fact that he should know. He's a CSO and he has previous experience as like a prosecuting attorney, and he should have known better. I don't think that we have to worry about anything. We're not planning on covering any big scandal up. So as far as like the judgment that's sent down to him, those rulings, so we don't know the sentencing, so those rulings look correct. As far as it does appear that he was maybe the primary one responsible, that Sullivan is the primary responsible for this issue, for the cover-up. But, like you were saying, there may have been some communications with the previous CEO at Uber.
Well, that's what we don't know. And I think my only argument is I actually am not opposed at the CSO being culpable and having some punishment, because whether or not he was the only person in the leadership team who knew, he took part in it, he led it, and he didn't put his foot down and say no. So I think him being charged with something is definitely okay. And it should be him. Let's say he knew, we know one attorney knew, and it may even be possible people on his team knew. But the attorney and the people on his team is technically below him. He is the highest person, the highest ranking executive at the company. So among those people, he is the one in charge, the one that's accountable. My only worry, again, is that And he should be charged no matter what, because he took part in the action. But I'm questioning, I just want to know, as a person, did he tell the executives? Do all the executives know he was covering up? Did all the executives, and because I just know CSOs, there's stories there where security folks want to do some stuff, but they get overruled by other executives. And if it's not anything illegal, that's fine. That's the way companies work. Your CEO is always the boss, no matter what your role is. You weigh in on your expertise, but at the end of the day, the CEO and the board make decisions when there's conflict between, when different leaders have different opinions. He is ultimately responsible, but I want to know if other executives knew and actually participated in this being their response, rather than what should have been a pretty simple, transparent response. Companies get breaches. While customers don't like it, I think it's pretty obvious that if you transparently, openly, share a breach, you do your due diligence to protect your customers from the data that was lost, and you show that you're willing to fix the problem, these breaches, there's no reason to cover them up, because you can actually increase your security and have a good customer experience by fixing the problem. And I think, so I'm not upset that he got held to account. I just wonder if other C-levels, if they knew too, I feel like other C-levels should have been held to account as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right to suspect that there were some other C-levels. The issue.
By the way, I don't know, Trevor. It just seems unusual that they wouldn't know. Maybe that's me as a CISO myself. Like, I would never, if I knew of a breach, the first thing I do is, besides starting an investigation the proper way, is inform others. So it's just surprise. If it literally was just him and the lawyer, he is clearly the one.
Yeah.
But if other C-levels knew, I think that others should be held accountable too.
So during that time that the breach happened, the Uber was already under some type of investigation by the FBI for a previous breach. And so it sounds to me like that's the reason that they were trying to hide it. And I also read that, to your point, I also read that the CSO was asked if he would roll on, or basically give up the information to give the prosecution a chance to prosecute the previous CEO. And so we don't know all the details, but it does look like there was something there.
By the way, that's the interesting part. But do know the new CEO of Uber, the one that I think is still active, he definitely didn't know, because during this period of time when this happened, a new CEO and some other executive team came in, and it was actually the new CEO that pushed to do the right thing. It was the new CEO that let go of Sullivan. But yes, you're exactly right. It's the leadership that was with Sullivan during the breach that I'm curious how much they knew, and not the staff that didn't know, not even the attorney that knew but was not. He's not a decision maker. The company, he's not an executive, so he's not responsible for the decision. But if that ex-CEO, the one before the new guy that took over and started writing some of this stuff, I just want to know what he knew. But either way, I think the one thing we can agree, that's still not an excuse for the CEO. I mean, the takeaway, if you're a C-level out there in security, do you need to worry about this now that they're prosecuting CSOs? I don't think so, because most of you are going to do the right thing, right? I mean, if a customer data gets lost, we have laws that have mandatory data breach disclosure. And personally, I'm going to follow all the laws as a CSO. And more importantly, I want to transparently communicate when I need to protect my customers. When you lose customer data, you're not just mea culping, oh, I got breached, too bad. You've put your customers at risk. There's now something out there that if the customer doesn't know anything about it, they may not be able to take actions like ID theft protection or freezing their credit that could protect them from other attacks. So if you're a CSO that does the right thing, you shouldn't have to worry about this. That said, as a CSO, you probably know that when you're dealing with other executives, when you have to make really hard decisions during security events, people will have different opinions. And at the end of the day, you may not be the ultimate decision maker. So the one thing a CSO or CISO should remember from this incident is you could be held liable. So if anyone else in your executives, if you want to do something, but folks that are above you are saying, no, we're going to do it this way, I mean, if they're the leaders, that has to happen. But I think your only choice is to resign. You have to stand up for the lawful legal way to do things. Otherwise, you could be the one holding the bag when there's criminal charges. So that to me is the takeaway. Hopefully most CSOs don't even worry about it because we're trying to protect against breaches. But in the worst case, if they happen, we would do all the right things to take care of them. But if you're ever at conflict with other leadership, if it comes down to it, remember this incident as an example. One, it's a case you can say for why you convince other leadership not to cover things up. But more importantly, if it ever gets forced by whoever, you might have to leave the company, and it probably is in your best interest in that case. So anyways, an interesting case. I'm sure as the first CSO being guilty for a criminal charge, I think we'll hear a lot more about it in the news. So thanks again, everyone, for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Twitter. You can find me as @SecAdept, and you can also find Mark when he's around as XORRO_ or Zorro. Trevor, any place people can reach you, or are you less a Twitter person?
Not so much Twitter person. It's gonna be you can email me.
Well, in either case,
use snail mail.
You can reach all of our podcast team, both me and Mark, and even we can forward stuff to Trevor at the hashtag the 443 podcast. Thanks again for listening, and you'll hear from us next week.